Hello, Netrunner fans, and welcome to part 1 of my creation and control retrospective. Over the course of the next 2 videos, we're going to look back at creation and control from our modern understanding of the game. And we're going to talk about some of the things that the designers got right about the first big box, and some of the things they didn't get so right. Before we begin by looking at the HB cards, I just wanted to quickly put into perspective how long ago creation and control was. We are currently in the midst, as of the time of this recording, of the 6th overall data pack cycle, and Creation and Control was released after the first cycle was completed. So while this review might be a little more critical than some of my other reviews, keep in mind that this is using a hindsight is 2020 sort of perspective. I'm looking back at the game knowing all that we do in 2016, and the design team couldn't possibly have known this at the time that Creation and Control was released. We're going to start by looking at the IDs in the box, and any discussion of HB IDs needs to include a discussion of engineering the future. I remember at the time of Creation and Control's release, I was really shocked that HB was the Corp faction in the box, because I felt like out of core set, HB was the most fully formed and at the time was just a really strong faction, and engineering the future was a big component of that. It's pretty obvious to me that ETF is just a little too easy to realize all of the economic advantage from it, but if you're going to set that as the 4515 baseline, all of the other IDs have to compete on some level with that. And I think we're going to see that basically no HB IDs have done that in the history of the releases so far. Cerebral Imaging was the first ID in the box, and I think is just a model of how good ID design can work. This is, I would say, the second most popular ID out of HB overall, but like I said at the beginning, there's a massive drop-off after ETF. This is largely manifested as a combo deck, because this huge hand size makes it a lot easier to assemble the combo pieces in your hand, and this is just the right level of power for an ID. I really like how this fundamentally changes the way that you have to play the faction, because it really breaks a lot of the rules. Having such a huge hand size really changes a lot of dynamics, and the fact that it's tied to your credit pool gives the runner a way to play around it a little bit, in that they can siphon or vamp you or something like that to affect your maximum hand size. It's pretty impressive how right the design team got this ID. This is certainly a bold design, and I think would definitely make me a little nervous to put in print, but it's certainly worked out really well. And this is what I like to see with the ID design, changing basic rules, really powerfully influencing the way that you want to build a deck. This is just a model for good ID design. The second ID is Custom Biotics, and this is easily one of the worst IDs in print. I think fundamentally it's just a terrible idea to give an ID a primary advantage of having more influence. I think influence is not the type of thing that you want to mess around with like that. And at the time of this card's release, it was pretty shocking. There was only one ID that had something other than 4515, at least on the Corp side. So getting a 22 was pretty shocking. But I think we've proven that it's just not good enough to get this extra influence, especially when you can't play Jinteki cards, which are a lot of the cards that you'd want to spend your influence on anyway. I would have much rather seen just a totally different ID in this box, and my suggestion would be something that interacted with hosted condition counters. We'll be talking about that more when we get to the hosted condition counter card in the box, but I'll just put it on the screen here so you can see my general concept. The final ID on the Corp side was Next Design. And this ID is one that has made me so sad looking back at it, because it's such an interesting design. This front-loaded thing where you get to not only install ice, but draw up to 5 is really powerful at the beginning of the game. And it also encourages you to play tons of ice in your deck, which jives really well with one of my favorite agendas in the game, Accelerated Beta Test. 12 influence is easily the reason why this idea has not seen a lot of play, and it's obvious to me that even if we account for ETF being a little too good, this should have had more rather than fewer influence than ETF. I think if this was a 45-17, it would be a lot more interesting. There would be some trade-off between this and ETF, and if we had maybe a slightly power-adjusted ETF, I think the 17 influence would be really competitive with 45-15 out of ETF. It makes me sad that this idea has not really seen a lot of play because it is such a really interesting and well-designed card, and I think this shows why we don't want to fool around with influence. If you just give an ID slightly too few influence, or in some cases like Near Earth Hub, slightly too many influence, you're going to end up with either an ID that sees no play, or an ID that sees almost exclusive play. Now we're going to look at the agendas in the box, and I think these are really representative of some of the problems with agenda design early in Netrunner, and we're going to be going through that in quite a bit of detail. The first ID is Director Haas Pet Project. This is a 3-for-1. 3-for-1s are bad, and I think pretty much that's the whole story with this agenda. I've included this in a handful of decks, and I think there's a few people that have played it on and off, but if you're going to have a one-of unique agenda, it needs to be absolutely groundbreaking, and I think really should be something that's in most HB decks. I don't think that's really possible with a 3-for-1 body. I would have much rather see this as a 3-for-2 that did essentially the same thing, or I would prefer a 5-for-3 with an even more powerful ability. Here's my suggestion of how to do that while maintaining the same basic flavor of the card. And if you watch my 5-for-3 video, this type of thing should be fairly familiar. 5-for-3s need to have absolutely powerful abilities, and they need to be some of the most powerful card effects in the game, period. Having that precedented in one of these early big boxes, in the faction that really represented Glacier from most of early Netrunner, I think would have been a good way to set that precedent. And really, I just don't think this unique 3-for-1 ever did much for the faction and was really a disappointment from a flavor perspective. The second agenda was Efficiency Committee, and this has easily worked out the best of any of the agendas in this box. This has largely been used in Cerebral Imaging combo as a way to gain a whole bunch of clicks, but I really like the interaction with this card with Shipment from Sansan. It lets you kind of launder those clicks so that you aren't actually advancing, you're just playing a card that advances. And that's really cool and interesting and has allowed HB not only to use the combo thing with Cerebral Imaging, but also fast score 3-for-2s. This is one of the early 4-for-2s that was actually good enough. And I think if all the 4-for-2s in Netrunner were on the same level as this or like Nisei Mark II, agendas would just be so fundamentally different. The 5-for-3 in the box was Project Wotan, and I think this is a huge missed opportunity to make a 5-for-3 that really defined a Glacier style. This is just not strong enough, and while I have seen this card used in an effective way, this is generally just going to add taxes, either in terms of clicking through a Bioroid or paying to break a Bioroid. And if you're going to make something that makes your ice more taxing, it needs to be a lot better than this. It's also worth pointing out that in Second Thoughts, which was just 2 data packs after Creation and Control, we saw the Wotan piece of ice, and I think the design team tried to build in a combo between the agenda and the piece of ice, because the piece of ice you can't click through like you can with every other Bioroid, and the agenda gives you some hard end the runs that you can put on it, so that makes your opponent have to actually break Wotan. While it's not lost on me what they were trying to do here, I think it's pretty obvious that this combo is too weak, and I would have just liked to see the Project Wotan agenda just have a completely obvious interaction with the Wotan piece of ice. Here's my suggestion of how to do that. Big agendas and big ice, this is definitely HB's domain, and I think really just the power level of the high-end expensive effects in Netrunner has been far too low. The last HB agenda in the box is Sentinel Defense Program. This is a perfect example of how 4 for 2s were too weak early in Netrunner. This is really situational, it's really difficult to use. You're going to have to build your deck around this card to really get much of a benefit out of it, and there are so many much more general use 4 for 2s that you could play instead of this. I think an easy way to make this better would have just been to essentially swap around net and brain damage. If you did this, then there'd be some incentive to including these Jinteki or other net damage oriented ice in your deck, and something like Cobra is way cooler with this version rather than the one that's printed. We've seen some HB flatline tools that are largely about reducing the maximum hand size of the runner and doing lots of brain damage, and having a good 4 for 2 to kind of base that whole strategy on would help a ton. Plus, it would incentivize the play of like Neural EMP, Shock, or Snare in an HB deck. Before we move on to the assets, I wanted to quickly bring up a point I've made in a lot of my videos, which is that subtypes in Netrunner have been massively underutilized. And I think Creation and Control was an opportunity where we fed a bunch of subtyped cards into the game, but within the context of Creation and Control, there wasn't a lot of play off of those subtypes. The first asset is Alex. And this card, I'm not sure if I've ever seen it rezzed in a game. It's just too hard to get a lot out of this, and it especially doesn't make a ton of sense in HB, where we haven't seen a whole lot of the mass assets sort of thing. This card obviously makes a lot more sense if you're installing a whole ton of assets, and I don't think that's really what the design team had in mind. I think whenever you install a card is supposed to mirror engineering the future, but since this is a trashable asset that you're going to have to put in its own server, that is so much harder to realize a benefit from versus ETF, which is just your ID. I would have really liked to see this as a Bioroid tribal card. I think it makes sense thematically, and I also think that would have been a lot more powerful. Here's my suggestion of how to do that. This, I think, would just be a lot easier to pump up quickly and get a lot more benefit out of in the long term. And this I could see competing with something like Adonis or Eve for deck slots. The next asset is Cerebral Overrider, and this card is one of the most perfect cards in the box. I really like these advanceable assets when they work correctly, and this is just a perfect example of one where it's actually worth the risk to including it in your deck. If you hit somebody with this thing, it's pretty much GG, or at least it pushes you a lot closer to winning. And this has been an absolutely monstrous staple in decks like PE, or pretty much anything that can run Mushin Notion. We haven't seen a whole lot of this out of HB, but I think that's okay. And this card, I think, has largely worked exactly how it was intended. It's one of the greatest Mushin targets in the game, and is just one of the perfect examples of did they or didn't they sort of bluffing in Netrunner. Next up is Director Haas. As it is, this additional click thing has pretty much only been used to fast advance 3 for 2s. And the problem with that is a 3 to res asset that when it gets trashed, they get 2 points. It's just not as good as a bunch of the other fast advanced tools that we already have, or even the thing I was talking about earlier with Efficiency Committee and Shipment from Sansan. I think this card made it into print as largely a reprint from the original game, though they did have the good sense to make it only worth 2 points rather than just losing you the game when it's trashed. Even still, that 2 points thing is too much of a downside, and I think the upside needs to be much more powerful. Here's my suggestion of how you could do a Bioroid tribal card while still maintaining the basic executive framework of this card. Director Haas is one of the most recognizable characters in Netrunner, and as such, I think she should have had some really powerful defining effect that made her a lot more playable. With this version of the card, you would be able to put the Bioroid subtype on a variety of other cards, and they would work with her very specifically. Bioroid agendas, I think, are a particularly good example. You could make Project Wotan a lot more acceptable to play if it was defensible by a card like this, and I think you can make a similar argument about agendas that were printed later, especially something like Domestic Sleepers. The next card is Haas Arcology AI, and this is another card that's just kind of a bad fast advance effect that isn't as good as options we already had, like San City Grid or Biotic Labor. This is just a risky version of Biotic Labor that you could potentially use multiple times, and I would have really liked to see this buffed where it could be advanced either rezzed or unrezzed. That would at least make it a little bit more interesting. That was more like the original version of this card. In fact, that's almost identical to the original version of this card. And another point I would make is, why doesn't this have a subtype? This is another card where it could be differentiated from other cards by having a subtype. Maybe you would play this over Biotic Labor if you had something that interacted with its subtype. Next up is Thomas Haas. And this is, I think, probably the biggest mess of a card in the entire box. First of all, let's just talk about his ability. If you advance this, it's going to require you a click and a credit to do so. So when you trash him, you're just going to get the two credits that you put into this card back. So it's more just a way to bank credits rather than giving you some sort of bonus. So really the only context where this card is going to be worthwhile is if you can somehow bluff your opponent. And we already have Cerebral Overrider and a million better ways to do that. This card to me just really doesn't make a lot of sense. And the fact that it's Thomas Haas, who is the son of one of the most prominent characters, I feel like this should be a card that has a really powerful, unique effect that you basically can't do otherwise. I think this should have just been a totally different card, and here's my suggestion of how to do that. I think this kind of mirrors his role with the Source in a way. It's a defensive effect, and it also mirrors the executive aspect, which is something that the original design doesn't have. I think just in general, Thomas Haas was a big missed opportunity to make a flavorful, powerful effect that would get players talking more about the storyline. Next up is Bioroid Efficiency Research. This card, I think, has really worked out well, except that the surrounding card pool hasn't really accommodated it. Like I said before, I would make this a Bioroid type, and my suggestion was an ID in the form of custom biotics that would interact with this type of card. So I think that that could be a role for a different sort of Bioroid deck, where it would be based on playing these condition operations, and we've seen a fair amount of those printed since the release of Creation and Control, and I don't think they've really seen that much play because there isn't something that gives you a bonus for using these hosted condition counters. I would really like to see HB do that. I think that it fits them thematically. They're doing engineering, trying to make their Bioroids more efficient, and I think that really just fits this card to a T. Next up is Successful Demonstration. I think this card has largely worked as intended, and I think has been kind of underutilized. I like that HB has some of these more fringe economy burst effects. We also see it with like peak efficiency as well. And I think just generally this is a pretty good way to give HB an alternative economy burst effect like this. It fits the whole ice and runs aspect of them, that you want to be able to stop them with your ice. That sort of puts some tension with the Bioroids, most of which don't actually stop them. And I think this card has just largely worked out pretty well. Next up, we're going to look at the ice. And one thing I wanted to say is that I think there was a concerted effort here to make a sort of tribal thing, like I was talking about earlier, work. We're going to be looking at quite a few cards upcoming that have some sort of interaction with Bioroid Ice, and those are just largely too weak. I think if they had been done a little bit better, it could have been more conducive to building a deck that is very mass Bioroid, all about the Bioroids. And that's something I really would have liked to see precedented in the first big box. The first piece of ice is Heimdall 2.0. I really like this ice. It's huge. And I think huge HB ice is something that you really need in a box like this. I probably would have put Wotan in here instead of this, but nonetheless, I don't dislike this piece of ice. I think we've definitely seen this card in play. It's a really big taxer, and I think only recently, as we've gotten more and more cheaper and better mid-range Bioroids, has this fallen out of favorability. This is a pretty cool way to do a big high-end barrier. I think nowadays it could probably be a little bit better, but all around this has worked out pretty well. Next up is Howler, and this is one of those pieces of ice that had a Bioroid tribal sort of theme. And this, as a trap type piece of ice, has all the trappings of a terrible trap type ice. It's 0 strength, which means you can parasite at instant speed really easily, and it also doesn't really do enough, even if it goes off. They can just jack out after you do that, and that's really just not that great. My suggestion would be to combine Howler with Mine Layer that we're going to look at later, and I'll just talk about that when we get to Mine Layer. Next up is Ichi 2.0, and Ichi was one of those monster pieces of HB ice from the core set, so this was a logical follow-up for Creation and Control, making a better, bigger, stronger Ichi. And I think this largely lived up to the appeal. I think if you were making this today, you could probably make it a little stronger, but this has still seen some play, and I think it's pretty flavorfully there and just generally has worked out pretty okay. Next up is Mine Layer. Mine Layer and Howler were two of these early ice that I think got outclassed by Architect once we eventually saw that. But either way, I think these concepts are pretty decent for HB. Just the ability to assemble big servers, I think, has generally been the domain of both Wayland and HB. And like I said before, I would like to see a combination between Howler and this. So here's my suggestion of how to do that. It would give you this powerful building a server effect, but that's basically all the card does. And this win-res thing I think could be kind of interesting with some of the D-res stuff that we've seen in later HB releases. Next up we have Victor 2.0, and this is definitely an upgrade from Victor 1. If you watched my core set review, you saw me say that Victor 1 was largely terrible, and I think just really was always yogged in a way that wasn't really fair to the card. Now this, I think, is a little better. I think it's interesting the way it does the hosted power counter thing. It reminds me a lot of Data Raven, which is a really great piece of ice. But I think just really this was a little too weak. At the time of its release, it saw a fair amount of play, but I think that was largely just the function of HB didn't have a lot of great code gates, and there weren't a lot of easy ones to splash. Once we started to see some better mid-range code gates, this really fell out of favor. I don't think it's really come back since then. The last piece of ice was Zed 1.0. This card sucks. It's just never really seen play, and I think it's got the same problem that Chum has, although its positional aspect is a little different. This is like a Chum where it has to be in the right position, but then sometimes it still doesn't work. This really needed to have an impactful subroutine in addition to the two that it has. I would have just had it resolve a subroutine on a res piece of Bioroid AP ice. I think that's thematically pretty appropriate. It'd still be tricky to use, but it could do something nasty in addition to these two pretty interesting subs. Now we've come to the upgrades, and the biggest point I'd make is these really had the right concept of trying to incentivize playing big Bioroids and kind of this Bioroid tribal thing, but they just were far too weak and not implemented well. First up is Awakening Center. This card is, I think, supposed to be kind of like Ash in that it gives you this way to defend a big server, but I think the core flaw with this card is that it has to host the ice. If you were able to just reveal the ice after they passed all the pieces of ice, that would be a lot stronger, and I really don't think hosting the ice, there's really any way to make that good enough. It's such a downside to have to host some of your necessary ice. I mean, you're probably only playing like, 17 or so in your deck, and you're going to have to host one of those on this or if they don't run that server, there's just a huge opportunity cost to placing your ice on this card. So the way I would have done this is just make it trigger after you pass all the pieces of ice, then you can reveal the ice, and it'll still just do essentially the same thing. I'd also give this the Bioroid subtype for the reasons I've talked about in this video. Next up is Tyr's Hand, and here's a card that I think is kind of a mess. First of all, the timing of this is pretty confusing. There isn't really a card that works like this. And on top of that, there's something that I think is not really obvious about just this card when you first read it, which is when you prevent the sub from being broken, it doesn't prevent them from just re-breaking it. So, in other words, I think the core idea of this card is if the runner clicks through a Bioroid and then you use this as a surprise, they won't have any clicks left, and now they have to deal with the subroutine. That's way too conditional and way too of a dream scenario to make this card worth including in a deck. If you're going to have a card like this, it's got to do a lot more. My suggestion would be that you could choose a subroutine on a res piece of Bioroid ice, and then all of those subroutines on all of your Bioroid ice couldn't be broken with icebreakers during the run. So that would basically let you stack up several ice that have similar subroutines, and if you pop this thing off, they would have to come up with ways to break it other than icebreakers, which would probably mean either clicking through it, or they might just have to jack out or deal with the ice and then rerun the server. This also makes the really nasty subroutines on higher end Bioroids a lot more impactful, and I think that was kind of the idea of this card to begin with. Now we've come to the neutral cards, and I think like with the HB cards, these are just not very good. First up is Gilahan's Arcology. Early in Netrunner, around the time of this release, this card saw a fair amount of play. But this was pretty good at the time of its release, mainly because economies for corp decks were terrible. And you just really needed any card that was going to make you credits. This is an example of a card where you were willing to sacrifice other agendas in order to have an economic advantage. Now, this card I think makes a lot of sense, and I wouldn't change a whole lot about it. The biggest thing I'd suggest is, why not give this a subtype that would make it compete for other slots? You know, one of the things about subtypes is you can make a lot of cards that have similar effects, and if you use subtypes well, there's a reason to play each of those different kind of vanilla effects. I would have given this the Arcology subtype, and then you could later build all kinds of cool stuff around Arcology. We already had the Haas Arcology AI earlier. That'd give you 2 Arcology cards in the box, and you could just do cool stuff with that later. Next up is Levy University, and this card looks downright preposterous when you compare it to the asset spam stuff that we were just looking at in 2016. And I think this was even too weak at the time of its release, just because that's a really expensive way to go about tutoring for your ice. I would have rather just seen an operation that tutored for ice, or maybe just making this substantially better where you could, use it once per turn, but it was a lot stronger and a lot harder to trash. Just something has to give with this card because it's just far, far too weak at its current printing. Next up is Server Diagnostics, and I think the impulse for this card is spot on. There should be a card that has a strong drip effect that takes a little bit of time to realize, but it has this self-trashing thing that kind of de-incentivizes playing ice, right? Like a deck that doesn't play a lot of ice can abuse this card, but I think the when you install is just the core problem. It's just far, far too weak. I think there are other ways that you could do kind of a similar idea. Like my suggestion would be it trashes when you res a piece of ice during a run. So if you could build a deck that resed your ice at unusual times, like not during a run, then you would be able to keep Server Diagnostics in play. Something like that would feed into the condition counter thing I was talking about earlier. I think just generally would be a lot easier to use. So while I think the core framework for this card is pretty smart, the particular implementation was just always too weak. Also, 2 trash cost is pretty unacceptable, especially after we got through the mass asset era and saw a lot more assets with bigger trash costs. Next up is Bastion, and I think generally this card is just so obvious that there's really not a lot to say. There needs to be a barrier like this. I think it kind of makes sense to put it in creation and control, and while I don't think this has seen a ton of play, there kind of is a need for a card like this in the card pool, so I'm fine with it. The last corp card is Data Pike. This card has definitely seen some play, and I think is a fitting addition to the card pool as a taxing end the run code gate. We already had that in the form of Enigma, and this I think is basically on the same level as Enigma. And just generally, I think this has worked out okay. I think nowadays you could probably make this card a little bit stronger, but all around I think this is okay. That's going to do it for part 1 of my creation and control retrospective. Unfortunately, the HB half of this box I think has largely not succeeded. It's tried to build out the breadth of the faction, but so many ways that was implemented were far too weak. And I think especially when we already had the precedent of Fast Advance ETF or Glacier ETF, the cards in this box didn't really give us a whole lot of reason to deviate from that. And I don't think there's really a whole lot of reason to deviate from that even today. So while I think this box succeeded from both a flavor and artwork, and to some extent even mechanics perspective, since the particular implementations were far too weak, a lot of this half of the box has not seen that much play. Thanks for watching this video. If you liked it, be sure to subscribe and give me a thumbs up, and be sure to tune into part 2. We're going to see a totally night and day difference between the two halves of these boxes. The runner side is seriously awesome, and while there's some bad cards over there, there's also cards that basically created the entire Shaper faction. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you soon for some more Netrunner stuff.